Our content is for informational purposes only and is not a substitute for personalized professional advice. We recommend that you consult a qualified, licensed professional, such as an experienced tax advisor or registered financial advisor. All investments involve risk, values can fluctuate, and past performance is not a reliable indicator of future results. While information referenced is believed to be reliable, its accuracy or completeness is not guaranteed, so we assume no liability for any errors or omissions.
You are listening to NOVASHER NEXUS, a podcast that bridges the gap between high-level geopolitical risk and how it impacts you.
Hi, and welcome to the NOVASHER podcast. I am Dan Novak, CFO of NOVASHER, handling all political and geopolitical events and risks. And today we've changed it up a little bit. I have a friend, Elliot Doyle, who had a very interesting career. I know, Elliot, you were in the oil business, and now you're doing the art business full time. In a second, I want you to introduce and tell us a little bit about what you do. But I also want to ask you kind of the state of the overall art market, like not any one period or piece or even a particular medium, but just overall, like, what are you seeing? Is a lot of people buying art? Is there a lot of people interested, and how that compares to how it's been previously? So why don't you go ahead and just kick it off here?
Hey, Dan, thank you so much for having me. And Dan and I go back to Oxford, where Dan was a brilliant PPE student, undergrad, and I was a history of art student up the road. And since that time, I did 3 master's degrees, one in geopolitics on global security studies, an MBA, and then a master's in the art trade focused on Asia, about Western art. But okay, that's a great broad question, Dan. And I'd love to answer this and thinking about it. I would say great new rising powers, nation states, are acquiring things that reflect their national story and their history. And it's almost like a reassertion of national identity with great powers like China, and seeing Germany and Japan rising. And we're seeing in Germany now, they are starting to acquire more works of art that were historically too sensitive for them to acquire, whereas the Chinese have been aggressively buying and acquiring fairly conservative art and antiques back. I mean, I think it's definitely a reflection of the United States and Great Britain and European nations where they see themselves, how they view themselves today. I don't know if we have such a positive light, such a positive self-image. I would say at the high end in the United States, it's driven by a few powerful dealers and a few powerful billionaire collectors. And most of that, Dan, at the high end, at the highest level in the United States, is all purely commercially focused on modern and contemporary art, sort of 1930 till today. There's not much interest in fine European old master paintings like there was in America at the robber baron and the industrial age, which is interesting because I don't think Americans want to identify themselves, or perhaps they don't identify closely to Europe anymore. I don't know why that is, but there's just not a lot of interest, and there's not a lot of cash being thrown around in the old master market.
You give me a lot to that I can ask about there, but I just want to go back to what you were saying about kind of emerging powers. Take China, the biggest one, and saying, like, a lot of Chinese collectors are interested in acquiring pieces that reflect China's history, or maybe East Asia more broadly, but definitely they're interested in kind of their own history rather than necessarily buying fine European or American pieces. They're interested in their own. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. And I think it's remarkable to say that there is so much interest in fine European and American art in mainland China as well, in addition to the demand for antiquities and cultural patrimony, or whatever you want to call it, in China, or reestablishing their national identity through art and antiques.
Mm-hmm. And yet from say the North American European collectors, they're more interested in acquiring either global art or kind of modern and contemporary art, but not much interest in sort of the pre-1930s kind of stuff that reflects, an earlier period. And it kind of that just suggests something to me about kind of national attitudes and cultural attitudes that, Europeans don't seem to want to talk about, that period is a colonial period and things there. Maybe the modern stuff after that's gone, reflects that. Maybe that is that. Do I have a good cultural kind of political read on that, or do you disagree?
I agree 100%, Dan. And I think a nice term for that would be traditional art, traditional Western art, which includes all the historic baggage of the West, of Western Europe. That sort of art has sort of been put aside. And I feel that a lot of that seems to be out of guilt, out of cultural guilt, that young people and families today don't want to acquire beautiful traditional works of art, of
Mhm.
European art.
Yeah, and I mean, you
It's
see that
fascinating.
yeah, I mean, you see that in a lot of our culture. I mean, if you say, even just a phrase that somebody says, we think things were better back in the olden days, the 19th century, and somebody will immediately say, "What, you want slavery and colonialism back? You're racist." Like
Yes.
that's immediate. And when you say, "No, I like the simpler life," and the art that I like reflects that. I mean, even saying that would be controversial, and it kind of
Yeah.
reflected in the tastes that we find with art. So I mean, I that it comes out that way, it doesn't surprise me at all.
And I think there's been a lot of shaming by the academic community of what we would call traditional art. I think there's been a lot of shaming, and I feel there's a lot of shaming probably on the art students too that are inclined to make beautiful traditional realist type paintings and sculpture, or even harping back to neoclassicalism and classical antiquity. I feel like they're probably shamed academically because of the baggage of Western history.
Yeah. So I just want to move over a little bit to the financial side, art as investment here, and certainly what we've seen. I mean, and I think I can't speak to the art market directly. I'm going to put that to you in a second here. But one thing we saw with, kind of with inflation, when inflation started to kind of the dragon was rising, it sort of started around 2021 and took, a series of interest rate hikes to get it under control. Well, inflation's benign. You can just throw it at anyone. You can say just a generic 60/40 portfolio of stocks and bonds. Inflation's benign, the economy's strong, your stocks go up, the economy weakens, interest rates go down, your bonds recover. So it's fine. But when inflation is high, that doesn't work anymore because then you raise interest rates, both your stocks and your bonds go down. But so people are looking to alternatives. So something that isn't really correlated with inflation in stocks and bonds as much. The classic one is gold. But unless you're Scrooge McDuck, you probably don't sit at home counting your gold coins. You probably keep those in the vault and you just they just kind of sit there, right? Art is a
Right.
little different because at least art I can hang it in my wall or
Yeah.
put it on my coffee table or you know I can enjoy it as well as being an investment piece. So that's an alternative. There's other things, whether it's baseball cards or vinyl records or classic cards. There's other alternatives too. But art, in the very broad sense, is one that I'm hearing people are looking to as one of those alternatives. It may only make up 10 or 15% of your portfolio, but it's a way of diversifying away from that. So I'm asking you, do you see people that aren't just looking for the art because I want to look at it or even share it or museum at the high end, but as an investment, as a hedge against the moves in other asset classes?
And that's such a brilliant insight. And it's amazing to me. And that's certainly always been my excuse in acquiring probably more art than I should have, rather than owning stocks and bonds. But I feel that it's amazing to me that so few people even recognize and realize that art is an asset class outside of traditional stocks and bonds. And it may not necessarily be a good investment, but it certainly is an asset class. Um, and And there's one thing I guess I would like to say because it's fascinating. You mentioned all these points about inflation. You would have thought that the art, on a broader sense, would have gone up more in terms of more with a correlation with the S&P 500 and things, but only the things really at the high end, Dan, have. the average work of art, or I would even say mid-tier and decent artists and things like that, they haven't really performed. I think, with inflation. Personally, it's only a few big names that have, that have, that have competed, that have correlated with Tesla and Amazon and the S&P 500. Because whereas the rest of these guys are trading kind of like Johnson and Johnson, kind of flat. I guess Johnson and Johnson did have a little pop, but they certainly have. I would say the broader art market certainly hasn't performed with the broader stock market index, which is very aggressive. And I would say only a few big names like Albert Ullin or Christopher Wool or Cecily Brown or big contemporary names that people have to, you know, dish out a few $1 million at auction for. Those are the only ones I think that have really kept up with inflation, because the Christopher Wool back in 2010 probably could have got a really good one for under $100,000, and now would be probably be a few millions. So
Okay.
not many
And when you
artists have done that. Not many artists have done that, Dan. In fact, some have probably gone down, like Motherwell.
okay, so where would you say is the cutoff? We say the high end stuff that performs. Are we talking like 1 million, 5 million, less,
Yeah, I
more?
would say stuff around 1 million,
Okay,
under
so
5 million. And then,
which is okay if if I had 3 million to just throw around. I mean, okay,
Mhm.
but what about for somebody who has say like $100,000 but wants exposure to the high end stuff? So in other words, like I don't have enough money to invest in a full office tower, but I can buy a share of, say, an office tower holding company, for $100, whatever, right? But in that way, I can have exposure to something that I can never own fully. Is there a way to get exposure to high end art without
yeah.
sort of buying the full piece?
I mean, there are art funds and things. I'd be reluctant to recommend them. I'm a little frightened of them because I think people are so dishonest, and I'd be frightened of mismanagement. But there are art funds. People can buy art shares. Another thing I would say is that if you were brave, there are still beautiful opportunities under $100,000 and even under $10,000.
Mm-hmm.
There are beautiful opportunities if you do your homework, if you research artists, and if you're lucky and you get lucky at auction. There are still great opportunities out there. You have to be brave. You can't expect to get a well-known household name, but you'll get a fine name if you hunt around and do your homework, or have an art advisor who you believe in. But sorry, I just wanted to share that too.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And we're getting towards the end here, but I do have to ask a little more on the geopolitical side and how it relates to art and or art money, I should say. And like, are you seeing any shift in sort of the client base kind of between regional, as in, you know, like, is there more or less money coming from, say, East Asia or Middle East, you know, that's changing? I mean, has that changed, say, in the last few years, in the last 15 years? Has that really shifted? And I'm just wondering about kind of the money flows and where sort of the money from, even from North America, how
Mm.
that's shifted and how that money is moving and why.
That's a great point, Dan. There's the waves of disruption are here. They're coming. We don't know what those look like yet. I will say a major gallerist in New York just fired 30% of their staff, called Pace Gallery. So I think the traditional model of just selling these high end new products that are, we can call contemporary art, to hedge fund guys and other people, seems to maybe a thing of the past. I don't know why Pace would cut 30% of their people. And and we're seeing a lot of, yeah, I mean, I've spoken to artists as well that they think there's going to be a big pullback in art, and that things just got out of control, and that prices got out of control. And I would say also with Xi Jinping in China, certainly different than Hu Jintao. And when well, I don't know when Hu Jintao left. I guess Xi Jinping's been there a long time, but I mean, at one point, the demand for European luxury goods and fine wine and art was off the charts. It was absolutely off the charts. But that's tapered down, I think, because of political sensitivity. I don't necessarily feel that with the Chinese that that's financial. I feel like that's more of a political move on their behalf to try to not to, get in trouble with my thought.
Okay, and I think that's a good place to end. Thank you very much for coming on the interview. Really appreciate it. Elliot Doyle, thank you.
Such a pleasure, Dan. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Dan. Thank you.